production keeps prices down far more effectively. Comrade Karanja, His Excellency says you are unbalanced.
I am a man in search of man. I was never in search of God.
In Conversations today is a famous writer in Kannada who has also been a professor of English literature. If his writing emphasizes a somewhat existential approach to life, he has been an activist as the General Secretary of the People's Union for Civil Liberties in Karnataka. Today he heads an important literary institution. He's the president of the Sahitya Academy. He's been the chairman of the National Book Trust. I'm delighted to welcome Professor U.R. Ananthamurthy. Your writing and your work and your philosophy of life and living were circumscribed by, as you mentioned, a belief. And what was this belief? A belief in the divine? Was it in a moral framework within which you pursued life and happiness? What was this belief?
You know what, I also come from the background of a monastery where there used to be debates of this kind. You know, I have heard these debates. It was presumed that there is a divine. You know, I come from a Dvaita Vaishnava background, and there is one God, and it is Hari, and he has sanctioned all these things, you know, the moral and the ethical behavior prescribed for us. And nobody asked the question whether you believe in it or not. The question that was asked most often was whether the whole thing was logical or not. You know, the Pandits asked that question. And so whether I believe in it was not an important question. But it became important for people like me, probably because Gandhi's influence was also reaching these villages. And we had to re-examine some of our given assumptions about religion and caste and so on. I think my whole problem began with questioning the caste system, questioning the inequalities. And also, you know, people who supported this great belief system were land owners also. So there were contradictions. And hence from this belief, I moved on to a belief in Marxism. Okay. It was difficult to believe that because it denied all spiritual reality. So I had, even when I started believing in Marxism, I had a quarrel with Marxism. I think these quarrels have saved me. Otherwise, you know, I would have been dogmatic, or sometimes I even wonder whether dogmatic people are truly dogmatic when they talk to themselves. I began to talk to myself, which saved me. Huh? If you are talking only to others, it doesn't save you, but one has to talk to oneself. And I think some of the finest people whom I see either in religion or even in politics are people who have the capacity to talk to themselves. And then this belief in a kind of socialist revolution also began to be disturbed because I knew what was happening in the Soviet Union. And later on, you know, it has been that kind of a shodhana. You mentioned the idea of talking to yourself. Would you say that the process of your writing and this idea of the philosophy of the Navya movement, and you'll have to tell us about it, was a process of talking to yourself without really worrying too much about form and structure and an obsession with a message or propagating a value system, but a pure sort of stream of consciousness dialoguing? I wouldn't like to use the word stream of consciousness because this will limit whatever I want to say. But talking to oneself, true, and which is also very hard because you can also tell lies to yourself. Huh? And hence talking to oneself meant also choosing the right word to talk to myself, choosing the right kind of questions, which brings you automatically, because you are an artist, into the question of form. It didn't start with the question of form, it started with this kind of seeking that whisper in you. We don't hear whispers, you know. We hear only loud voices. Even when you talk to yourself, you may start hearing only the loud voices in you, your emotional life. No, you have to go further than that. You have to listen to whispers. I don't think that any one of us who do that can say that we have entirely succeeded, because the world is there and it somewhere predetermines even the questions that you ask of yourself. A literary movement predetermines the questions you want to ask yourself, and so you have to go further than that. That has been the difficult voyage, you know.
Could you tell us something more about the Navya movement, which was such an important force at that time, and you were a major proponent and a participant in the movement? What was this movement?
Yeah, you know, I should tell you, the whole movement started because we began to doubt language.
In what way?
Language of rhetoric, because we thought that a kind of verbalization had got us into a kind of a prison of our own consciousness. And so we had to question language itself, verbalization itself. And of course, we have to question it in terms of language. Okay? So I think the primary impulse for this change in any literary movement, even the literary movement that Wordsworth changed, you know, from 18th century to 19th century, was also a question of this kind. Can you speak the truth if you use language of that kind? You can't speak the truth. You will make only statements. You will only say things, you know, which are given to you. You can't make a self-discovery. So you have to change language. And even for the Navya movement, the impulse was that. And then and there was another. There was a lot of spirituality in India, where, you know, you arrive without traveling. We began to suspect all those arrivals without traveling through the experience. A child is born out of pain and conception, you know, 9 months and all that. So there was a lot of spiritual arrival in our poetry all over India, where you read Aurobindo, you read the Upanishads, you versify it, and you think that this is wisdom. No, we said, what is important is the process. And so when we gave importance to process, and then we were thrown back to the earth, the earthly experience, the realities of actual life. So you had to bring that kind of imagery. So one of the things we used in Karnataka was the smell of earth should come back to
the
writing. Because the smell of earth, when it rains on a hot place, has a divine smell also. So we called it Mannina Vasane, the smell of earth. Without the smell of earth, even the most soulful outpouring would not have a meaning. And that was a change in style. It's not merely a change in mind, but a change in form, change in imagery. That was the Navya movement.
You know, you also had many diverse influences. There was the traditional religiosity, the experience to Indian traditions that you had mentioned. And I remember reading this wonderful anecdote of this holy stone, and of your sort of testing the sanctity of the piece of stone by removing the stone and relieving yourself of the vacant space where the stone was, and waiting for the gods to reveal themselves in punishing you in some form or manner. You know, sort of somewhere midway between in your life of writing and career as a novelist. How do you feel that your worldview has changed from the beginnings as a young boy in a very traditional background, who has traveled abroad and lectured in the West and has been a teacher of English literature, has been a vice chancellor of a university which carried Mahatma Gandhi's name? Where do you feel you're now when you look back that many years?
You know, my childhood, since I come from an agrahara, very orthodox Brahmin place, I was surrounded by so many things which were supposed to be sacred. The tree is sacred, the stone is sacred, the water is sacred, everything. And then I don't know why, I had a need to demythify the whole place so that I could breathe and then recover something for myself.
Did you find the sacred to be claustrophobic?
Yes, I did at that time. But now, paradoxically, I begin to feel the other way around. So in a way, you may call it a contradiction. I am going against that kind of grain now in my writings. I can't easily do that. It has been a kind of a learning experience for me, And I can't accept that kind of sacredness also.
What is the kind of sacredness that you value today? Is there a legitimacy? Is there a value to the sacred?
Yes. I suddenly began to realize that all the European kind of thinking, which thinks that man is the center of the universe, was wrong. That's my first experience, stirring within me. And the second, I began to doubt what you call history, that everything is determined in history. And the third, as a result of this is very confused thinking, I began to doubt the whole idea of development. I had read in Marx, the beginning of all criticism is the criticism of religion. He was right in the 19th century for Europe. Unless you questioned religion, you could not begin to see things for yourself, because religion was so sarvajna. It claimed that it knew everything, that it had an explanation for everything. So he had to question it. Right, the beginning of thought is the beginning when you begin to criticize religion. But today I feel, when I meet my friends who are westernized, who are very intelligent, who are very sophisticated, they don't really think, because they do not criticize development. That is the foundation on which I stand now. How to develop a critique of development. All the world over, there is an attempt to destroy all little cultures, different ways of living, and the ecological disaster. All these have come as a result of a blind faith in development. And I found that all those people, who I thought were great martyrs, and I began to question Lenin, I began to question Mao Zedong, I began to question Marxist dogma, everything, when I thought development has to be questioned. Why did I question development? In order to recover the sense of the sacred. Okay? I'm not a sociologist. I can't put these things, in the proper manner, perhaps. But that's how I began to think. From a criticism of religion, which I began, I have come to a stage where I think that my mind should now be critical of development.
Do you feel in some way that as a very sort of almost a popular culture criticism of development in India has been that our religiosity or our tradition has somehow inhibited our development?
No. I said, no. Because I know if you bring a machine to my village, they will break a coconut and worship it. And we celebrate machines also. We, the kind of obsession that people might have who have come under the other kind of religious systems, the Semitic, is not the same with the Hindu mind. There again, I think you have to make differences. No, that's not it. As a matter of fact, my fear is that we may so innocently accept development, which you can see in every mafusal town of India. The tinsel, the plastic buckets, everything has come, without any resistance. I wish there was some resistance to ugliness, that development brings. It's not there. So I wouldn't put it in that kind of classical form, Indian religion going against we will accept, I think, family planning. All these things are going to be accepted, when once it reaches people. There is no religious opposition to it, no.
You have been primarily a writer, but a writer with obviously an activist commitment. You have been General Secretary of the People's Union for Civil Liberties, and do you see the writer as an activist, or a writer as a mirror to the society, who makes his judgment, who makes his comments, who offers his insights, his perspective, and then holds back?
No. A writer is also a citizen. If he is not a full citizen, he can't be a writer. But he may need to withdraw in order to write. That's only a strategy. You need to withdraw, be a little away from your immediate concerns. Once, and also to get a perspective. Once R.K. Narayan told me, very interesting. I asked him, why is it that all the 5-year plans, come into your novel after the plans are over? Why do you introduce them later on? And Mahatma Gandhi comes into your fiction after many years. He told me, there is a kerosene shortage now in Mysore, and we all think that is the worst disaster in our lives. After 5 years, it falls into its place. Okay? So that a writer may do. That doesn't mean that he is not involved, but when he writes, he has to have the integral picture in his mind. Okay?
Sometimes, almost inadvertently, a writer assumes a more activist role than he perhaps intended, and becomes a symbol of various value systems. It happened with Alexander Solzhenitsyn in recent history. It certainly happened with Salman Rushdie, with Taslima Nasreen. Where do we begin to draw this fine line between writer as activist and the society's legitimate response to the freedom of the writer to express himself and interpret society in the manner that his intellect encourages him or facilitates his doing so? You have been someone whose own work has sometimes come up against a fair amount of controversy.
It's a good question. I would respond like this. It is only in our countries, India, Bangladesh, Soviet Russia, a writer had a role to play.
What was that role?
That role was to be true to one's conscience and speak the language of conscience. And because, state power can be enormous in these countries. Since state power can have an enormous kind of influence in these countries, one has to keep one's conscience alive. That's one. And writers do play a role in these countries. There is respect for writers still in the people. Whereas if I go to any American college or university, I find writers are read, but they don't precisely have a role like this. When Shivram Karant, in my language, speaks against the Anusthavara, the atomic power plant, government has to listen. If an American writer speaks against something, they can ignore him. So a writer is more important. And hence, not that the writers there don't have a conscience. They also play a role of this kind. But this role becomes important in these countries because of a certain relationship between our literary traditions and the people.
You've also been a critic, both as a teacher of English literature and about Indian writing. What is the function and role of a critic, after all? If a writer writes a successful piece of work that communicates and translates and makes an impact and plays its role both as in the activist sense that you mentioned and in holding up a mirror to society, where and why does a critic need to come into this?
Yeah, it is assumed that the critic sort of midwives, is a midwife. Yes, but one should not make the critic's role more important than what it is, because there is a critic already in a writer when he writes. But criticism becomes important now when there are so many books and people don't know what to choose. Maybe a critic talking about the books and caring for the right kind of voice, may have an influence on the reader. But I wouldn't overdo the role of a critic, but he is necessary.
What would be your sort of idea of the ideal critic? What do you aspire to be in your role as a critic?
Do you know what? I should be able to recognize a new young voice in my language, which is the hardest, because I get so used to my own voice, my own way of writing. But if I can recognize a young writer, which I think I have always done, I have done it because he is also influencing me. You see, a critic's role ultimately is to be a watchdog of this creative continuity from one generation to another. And also, the writers do it, but a critic is one who safeguards your smriti. Without smriti, there is no literary tradition. You have to keep alive the continuity of memory. A critic does it. He links it.
You've also assumed at different times, you were chairman of the National Book Trust and you're now president of the Sahitya Academy. In a sense, you're seeking to now work through the structures of the establishment to promote writing. What has prompted this shift from being a writer, a critic, an activist, to now, in a sense, working through the structures of the establishment? And what do you hope to achieve in this persona?
You know, I was critical of every vice chancellor under whom I worked.
Till you became one?
No, I became one to see whether my criticism was very utopian, or I could not do things which I was critical of, and I think I succeeded. I mean, I had a contribution to make, and I did. Within the structure, I did not succumb to the structure, I changed the structure. I was very critical of Sahitya Academy. As a matter of fact, I am not one of the recipients of a Sahitya Academy award.
Yet.
Okay. I thought that if I am here, can I see that literary cliques do not happen? Can it be open to young writers too? I think we can do that. You know, some of these great organizations created in India need some honesty and sincerity, that's all, you know. I mean, they don't compel you to be wrong. I think it's sometimes self-created also. So I am experimenting with myself, and I have always quit things, you know, when I feel that I have to make compromises. For instance, I went on a delegation from Sahitya Academy to China. I spoke my word there, you know. I did not hide anything. Because, you see, if you forget that you are also an individual with a conscience of your own, but identify yourself totally with an organization, then you are not even useful for the organization. You have to retain that capacity for reflection.
You mentioned some time ago that you know, in your role as a critic, it was your striving to find this young writer in your language. You've also written, and I quote, that India is where you lived and India has many centers. To what extent do you feel a consciousness of being an Indian as opposed to your work as just a writer in Kannada looking for this young talent?
Yeah, you know, I wrote a poem once where I said, I would use the word I am an Indian only when I am abroad. Who are you? I am an Indian. In India, I never use the word I am an Indian. Who are you? I am from Karnataka. In Bangalore, if somebody asks, who are you? I say, I am from Shimoga district. In Shimoga district, I will say, I am from Melige. And that will define me. These are continuous identities. Now, you know, one of the bad things in Indian politics is to make these continuous identities contradictory. As if there is something wrong in saying that I am from Karnataka, I am less of an Indian. No. You know, we cannot have in India the kind of a nation that Europeans defined as a nation. And hence, India is multi-centered. That's why, you know, when I did my japa as an Orthodox boy, I stationed myself on the bank of a river, and then I asked Ganga, Yamuna, Jamuna, everything to meet in that water. Even the well water I drew, you know, to do my japa was a sannidhi, a coming together of all the waters. That has been the great tradition in India. So I find no contradiction, you know. I can be an Indian writer only writing in Kannada, not otherwise.
Professor Ananthamurthy, thank you very much. You are as sort of multifaceted and multi-centered as India is. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.